I've been running my business down in Busselton for about 8 years. Today, I just wanted to give a few agronomic tools that you might be able to use in this coming season to lift your pasture production after the pretty ordinary summer and spring that we had last year, and the lack of feed that we've all been talking about already today. There's just 4 things that I want to talk about. The first one is if you're still doing any renovation from here on in, adding a fast-growing species to your pasture seed to get a bit more early feed, and I'll put some numbers to show you the benefit of doing that. The grazing management that Ian touched on, a couple of things about the benefit. I'm going to use some trial data to show you the benefit of getting that grazing deferral right, and also getting your grazing residuals correct. In that, don't pull your animals out of the paddock before the grass gets too short. And some strategic use of nitrogen through the year. I mean, some people use nitrogen, some don't, but this year might be the year to use it, particularly early on, and again later in the spring to boost your hay and silage production. As well as that, I wanted to talk about using gibberellic acid, which is a natural plant growth regulator that you can spray on your pasture in addition to the use of nitrogen to get a higher level of production over and above just nitrogen application on its own. And finally, touch on just controlling insects, because there's a few about, and we want the animals to eat the pasture, not the bugs. So the first one, adding a fast-growing species. Look, I think a cereal is probably the cheapest and easiest one to add, barley or oats. Oats or barley, either one. You can add brassicas, forage brassicas and things like that. They can be a bit expensive. Even oats and barley this year are quite expensive and quite difficult to get hold of. But I'll show you, even if you're paying up to $1,000 a tonne for some clean oat and barley seed, I think it still can be worthwhile. And I'll show you some data that will hopefully convince you of that. And here it is. There's a couple of trials here from Western Dairy done in 2018, where they grew two rates of ryegrass seed at 25 and 35 kilos per hectare, and then they added oats at 50 kilos per hectare to those mix. There was 2 trial sites there, and you can see here on the first one on the left, that was that buoyant up, no real strike rate. And that does happen. It's not going to work every time, but I think generally, in my experience, most of the time it does create more feed in the first couple of grazings. And the data here is from the first 2 cuts from these trials. I think the Dardanup trial is probably more typical of what can happen when you add some oats to a ryegrass seed or pasture seed, where in the first 2 cuts, there's 400 or 500 kilos of additional early feed when you add just 50 kilos of oats to that mix, and at $1,000 a tonne, that's $50 a hectare, so it's $100 a tonne for dry matter. And when you think about what we've been paying for hay at the moment, it's pretty cheap dry matter in the time of year where we all need it. And generally, my clients that have been using this over time are using it more and more. So I think in addition to this trial information, farmers are recognising that it's providing good early feed when they're renovating paddocks. So here's some more data. This is a trial that I was involved in last year. It was also funded by the SoilWise project. It was called the Pasture Challenge, and there's a few people in the room here might have been involved in it. This was a paddock that was due for renovation on a farm, and we went and did a whole bunch of soil and plant testing the year before, and presented it to a group of farmers that were participating in the project and asked them to come up with an agronomy package to address the soil constraints that were presented by this paddock, and also provide a renovation package to get on top of the capeweed and barley grass that was sort of endemic in this pasture, and it was due for renovation. So it was replicated, and you can see there the various different treatments, and you can and it was at the closest part of the picture was a hill and going down into some wet flats. So capeweed and barley grass on the hill, and then more seed barley grass down on the wet flats there, and the various treatments the farmers did to address that, improve the pasture composition. And I'll just show you the results from the first 2 cuts to sort of emphasise this point on where adding a fast-growing species to your ryegrass and clover seed can really get some more early feed. So here's the first 2 cuts out of the trial, and the meat and potatoes was literally that was just reseeding ryegrass and clover after a spray out, and $151 a hectare for that seed brew, 25 kilos of ryegrass and 5 kilos of clover. And these other treatments here, the rippers had a bit more ryegrass and a few kilos of they used deep ripping to address compaction in their treatment, but they planted some sod buster radish in there to try and open up the soil and keep it open. And as well as that, pH group had 20 kilos of 2 ryegrasses and added 20 kilos of barley and 20 kilos of oats to that mix. So you can see there it cost a fair bit more because they had a perennial ryegrass in there, but there's several hundred kilos per hectare difference between the meat and potatoes treatment and the pH treatment in those first couple of grazings. So even though the seed cost was a lot greater, I think those early those fast-growing species that were added to the pasture mix really do back up that data that we saw from that one trial at Western Dairy, where you can get some more feed. Similarly, the biology group, they sowed a mixed cover crop species with dozens of different species of plants in there, and I think it was a Bell seed cover crop mix that they used, and they added a bit more brassica to it as well. So it's just showing the benefit of, in that case, sowing early. They went in pretty early, and also that having some of those fast-growing species in your pasture mix can get you a bit extra feed when we all need it. Just talking about grazing deferment, I agree with Ian that we've got to try to wait until there's at least 700 kilos of dry matter on the paddock before you turn the animals out there. When no one put their hand up saying that they've got any hay or silage on hand, pretty much they have to go out. So what I sort of think is that you really want to pick your paddocks that you're going to defer, and I think that you should concentrate on those paddocks that have got good composition, a good ryegrass and clover base, as well as paddocks that you've got earmarked for hay and silage production later on in the year, because you want to obviously improve your hay and silage stocks. And just on that, back at this trial last year, I didn't mention it, worth looking at is this this nil treatment here, barley grass and capeweed. It all got away pretty early at the break of the season. It was an early break last year, and it's producing as much early feed as these other treatments that have got fast-growing species in it. And later we did feed quality testing on these couple of cuts, and when it's young, capeweed and barley grass is pretty reasonable quality feed. So those are the paddocks that I think you can probably afford to hammer at the moment, and then look after the other paddocks that have got good pasture composition and try and take care of them, because the weeds get less and less valuable for you later on in the year. And grazing residuals. If you've done the grazing match, I recommend you do. You really 5 centimetres. I use my second knuckle as my gauge when I'm walking around paddocks checking grazing residuals, just poking in the ground. That's 5 centimetres for me, and it won't be that much different for you. It's really important that the animals come out before it gets lower than that, because that 5 centimetres of growth is the energy supply that the plant uses to get that first leaf growing, because it's not photosynthesising, it's got low leaf area on it. So it's got to get energy from that stem material that's there to get that first leaf out, then start photosynthesizing and grow the next couple of leaves. So I'll just show you some trial data again from Western Dairy showing, this was again done in 2018, where they simulated overgrazing every down to 3 centimetres at every grazing on this trial, doing it with obviously mower cuts. 5 centimetres ideal on the left, and they went down to 3 centimetres here. So that's the data there from those two, and again that's just the first 2 cuts out of that trial, and straight away there's already 400 kilos difference by just managing that grazing residual from the first couple of grazings. So it's really important to get that right, because to have the discipline to try and get that right. In addition to that information, they also had a treatment in this trial where they simulated turning the animals out too early, and they did a cut at the 1.5 leaf stage. So it was the first cut of the year to simulate not getting that grazing deferment right. Cut at the 1.5 leaf stage, and already you can see there, there's almost 700 kilos of difference between that and getting your grazing residuals right. When you transfer that on to, so they did that once, and then they went back up to 5 centimetres. So it's just a one-off early cut at the start of the year. This is the final results at the end of the year. The trial yielded up to 9.5 tonnes per hectare. But there was an ongoing penalty there for grazing at 3 centimetres through the year, and also that one-off grazing too early, cost a fair bit of dry matter in the year. So try to manage certain paddocks that you're going to want maximum production out of, and those are the ones that are going to be hay or silage paddocks, or paddocks that have got good grass composition, because you're going to need that as the season progresses. So when it comes to trying to push the grasses, particularly on this year when it's turning out to be a pretty ordinary break, and the grasses, if and when it does rain, the grasses are going to be coming into the colder time of year. I think nitrogen has got a place for strategic use this year. Some people use it regularly, some not at all. But I think I'm going to try and show you some information that might help you think about the value of using nitrogen and the extra dry matter that it can produce. I'm going to talk about where to use it, how much and when to use it. Again, I think, we've got to focus on the paddocks that we're going to get set up for hay and silage production later in the year. And an early nitrogen application can sort of set those paddocks up, rather than just leaving them tick along in this cold, wet time of the year and then throwing a heap of lock-up fertiliser on them. I think if we can keep them going, ryegrass will do pretty well when it's got a good amount of nitrogen underneath it in the winter. And also, again, looking after those ryegrass-dominant paddocks, improved species, because when we do lock up, and we might have to lock up more paddocks than we would normally do if we're trying to replenish hay and silage stocks, that's going to put the squeeze on all those other grazing paddocks. So I think there's a place for putting some nitrogen on those grazing paddocks as well, that have got good grass-dominant composition. So when it comes to how much, this data comes from the More Profit for Nitrogen project that was run in the eastern states. It was a huge project run over 5 years and started in 2016. And what they found in pasture systems is there's 2 extremes for your nitrogen application. There's a minimum and a maximum. And it sort of starts at about 20 to 25 kilos of nitrogen. And when I talk about kilos of nitrogen, this is units of nitrogen. So this is 50 to 55 kilograms per hectare of urea. So, you know that urea is 46% nitrogen. So 100 kilos of nitrogen is 100 kilos of urea is 46 kilos or units of nitrogen. So if you're using a compound fertilizer with other products in it, just have to do your calculations back to get a minimum amount of 20 to 25 kilos of nitrogen when you do that application. The research found that if you go lower than that, the results are quite variable economically, and you don't always get an economic response to going lower. So really, if you've got 50 hectares that you want to put 10 units of nitrogen on, you're better off putting 20 units of nitrogen on half the area, 25 hectares, to ensure that you get an economic response from that application. The maximum amount of nitrogen that you want to put on is 50 units, and that's probably when you're doing your lock-up type applications. I'm not suggesting that you would do that while you're grazing, but keep in mind that this is a typical fertilizer response curve, and you're going to make your most money when the curve is steep, and you're going to make most money from your first 25 kilos of nitrogen that you put on. As you start going up the curve and putting more nitrogen on, it's harder and harder to get a yield response as the curve tips over. So when money's tight, you're going to make more money out of the first 25 units. So just keep that in mind if you're thinking of using nitrogen as a strategy. Typically, the sort of responses that you get to an application of nitrogen are in the winter about 10 to 15 kilograms of dry matter per unit of nitrogen applied. So if you will put on 20 units of nitrogen in the winter, you could expect maybe to get 200 kilos of extra dry matter. And, nitrogen at the moment is about $1.70 a unit or per kilo. So if you get a 10 kilo response, that's $170 per ton of dry matter. It's, again, when we're paying what we're paying for hay, it's still relatively cheap dry matter. And if you get higher responses than that, obviously the cost becomes less. In the spring, generally, if it's a good spring, we can get responses of up to 20 to 30 kilos, and that really is cheap dry matter when you start putting nitrogen on in the spring. Keeping in mind also, though, that when you put, the value of that feed in the winter when grass isn't growing quickly is quite high. Often we're screaming out for feed in those wet periods, and I'll show you shortly the effect of that. When to apply it? It's been a pretty ordinary summer, and there's a lot of bare paddocks out of there. But one positive I think we can take away from that is that bare paddocks, when we get our first rains, and I know some people have had more than others, there's a flush of nitrogen that comes out of the soil organic matter that's sitting in the soil. Typically in our area, there's between 60 and 80 tons of organic matter sitting in the first 10 centimetres of soil. When it gets wet and when it's warm, the bugs start mineralising that nitrogen. And free nitrogen is available for plant growth in that, and it's called the nitrogen flush that we get at the start of the season. And when the paddocks are bare, there's more nitrogen available for plant growth, because if you've got a lot of dry residue sitting on the soil surface, particularly grass residue, the bugs tie up nitrogen when they're trying to break down the high carbon content of that dry residue sitting on the soil surface. They lock up nitrogen. When there's no residue on the soil surface, they just produce more free nitrogen from that organic matter. So there potentially is a benefit from having these bare paddocks this year, that you might get more soil nitrogen. I think it lasts about 4 to 6 weeks depending on the year, and then after that's when you need to start thinking about applying some nitrogen to the pasture if you need extra feed in front of the animals. Here's an example of that effect. This was an uptake phosphorus trial that was run for 4 years, and this is the third year it was run for. And this plot, I don't know if you can see this strip of green grass through here on this plot. That's a nil plot. Hasn't had any fertilizer applied for it for 3 years. And we came here on the 7th of June in 2022 after a break in late April and a bit of follow-up rain in May to do a cut. And we saw these nil strips with these green lines down the middle of them. The plots are much wider than that. And the reason was, the last cut of the year, we go through and take a mower strip out of that plot, and we leave the rest of the plot to seed down so that the trial reseeds for the following year. So it was purely the removal of the grass from that green strip that took away the residue, and the soil, the bugs in the soil were able to break down the soil nitrogen, and it wasn't tied up. Whereas where there was lots of residue either side of it, it was locking up the nitrogen. So that's just a bit of a visual effect of the benefit of what we're going to get from a bit of soil flush nitrogen with bare paddocks this year. Okay, so what I've got here is the average soil temperature for baling up over the last 5 years, month by month, as well as the blue lines, which is the average rainfall for the last 5 years for baling up. And the time that we're interested in is this time when it's cold and wet and miserable that we're all waiting for, when the grass slows right down. And this is the time when I think that we can use gibberellic acid and nitrogen to get a bit of a bump in production when it's cold and miserable and we're short for feed. This chart, I've done it in 3 different locations. The chart looks exactly the same. It's usually, pretty much at the start of July, and it goes through about 6 to 8 weeks in this green area. And it's just the minimum soil temperature that varies a little bit between. This is very similar to the chart that I got at Many Peaks down at up at Waruna last 2 days ago. That their minimum temperature is just soil temperature is a little bit higher, obviously being a bit further north. So I think this is the time when we can use gibberellic acid right at the start of that cold, wet, miserable time of the year. And it's, I think if you get the end of August or the middle of August and you're screaming out the feed and think, I've got to do something about this, I need more nitrogen, more gibberellic acid, you're really too late. You sort of have to make a decision based on this historical temperature data if you're going to use it, to sort of start on a date, because obviously it takes 3 or 4 weeks for the grass to respond and produce more feed. So we know that time of the year is cold and miserable. So we sort of have to, if you want to try and use some of these techniques, you have to pick a date and start. And if it is coming into the start of July and there's a big blocking high coming over the bight, then it's almost a no-brainer. If it's a warmer than average year, you might not get as much response from gibberellic acid. It works well when it's cold, but and they are forecasting a warmer than average year, but forecasts, as you guys, I don't have to tell you guys that forecasts aren't always that good. So you sort of have to just use historical data and start on a date and go, I'm gonna use some gibberellic acid. It ties in quite well with broadleaf weed control. Yeah, so you can mix it with some broadleaf weed herbicides and put it out and have a go with that if you want to try it. And I just want to go through how that might match up with your nitrogen strategies as well. So I've put a break here with a question mark. Some people have had reasonable amount of rain from that events that came through in early May. Others, Beck and Matt was saying to me that they've only had 25 mil, so it's pretty hard to call that a break, especially with the lack of follow-up that we've had. But the point I'm trying to make is this is the way I try and think about nitrogen strategies in a year or in any year, really. All this applies to any year of pasture management. I just thought that I'd go through it specifically for this year and how you might think about it. So like I said, that nitrogen flush lasts about 4 to 6 weeks. So you can think about 6 weeks later starting with your first, that's going to coincide hopefully with your first grazing. And then you can look at putting on a first application of urea or a nitrogen-based product as the cattle come out of that paddock. Gets a bit of nitrogen into the plant and then creates an opportunity to put some gibberellic acid on there as well. And the sort of responses I've seen on trial work of gibberellic acid at over and above the response you get from nitrogen can be as much as 500 kilograms per hectare of dry matter. And the full label rate of gibberellic acid is 20 grams per hectare. It costs $15 a hectare for that 20 grams. So that's $30 a tonne for dry matter. It's pretty cheap dry matter, so something you might want to consider using. And then we've got 6 weeks later to maybe think about coming back for a second nitrogen application in the middle of that cold, wet period. And then 6 weeks after that is you're getting into your lock-up fertiliser application. And again, lock-up paddocks as well as those good grazing paddocks that could benefit from a boost to the pasture production in the spring. You know, in some cases for beef or sheep grazers, you could perhaps take out that middle application, and 2 might be enough. But you know, I'm just trying to go through the thought processes that you might use to work out where and when to apply your nitrogen to boost your pasture growth rates. When to spread it. Here's another one which comes from the More Profit from Nitrogen project. In our environment, these high rainfall permanent pastures areas, we don't need to apply fertiliser before rain. We've got to get rid of that habit that our wheat belt cousins have taught us about charging out there before a rain event. The losses from getting a high leaching rainfall event after you've spread your fertiliser far outweigh the risk of a little bit of volatilisation, and the More Profit from Nitrogen project showed that volatilisation in a pasture that's got a bit of cover on it in our environments is virtually nil. So, this happened in Busselton last year. We had rain forecasts around first couple of weeks of September. There was lots of fertiliser spreaders putting out lock-up fertiliser on, and we got 130 mils of rain. So, you know, you can imagine how the value of that fertiliser when they get that much rain. So here's a trial that Jasani and I did back in 2020. It was a nitrogen leaching trial. It's one of the most complex field experiments I've ever done. Each one of those plots has got a tunnel dug underneath it where we buried a lysimeter with tanks down underneath it in the plot. We were collecting nitrogen leachate and trying to work out efficient ways to put on nitrogen without getting too much leaching. And unfortunately, that year we didn't get very much leaching rain at all, so it wasn't a great nitrogen leaching trial. But what we did do was test some of those best management practices from the better fertiliser decisions. You know, this concept of spreading nitrogen before and after rain, and we were hoping to capture that in the leachate. But you can see here, you know, at that cold, wet time of the year, that's the end of June, we applied, there was a front coming, we went out and put it out, 50 units of nitrogen before the rain, 50 units of nitrogen after the rain. Over 77 days, the 2 cuts there, we got 1,200 kilograms of dry matter for that 50 units, which was just exceptional, and I think a function of that was the year that we had where there wasn't a lot of leaching rain. You know, almost turned the year upside down on its head. You know, we've got 24 kilograms of dry matter per kilo of nitrogen applied, you know, which is sort of production figures that you'd expect to get in spring. But it just shows you there was no difference between confirming what the project says. There's no difference between applying it before and after rain. Why would you expose yourself to a risk of the Weather Bureau getting their rainfall projection wrong? I mean, and here's the spring application of that trial, you know, and I think it's relevant to what we're experiencing now. When you want to apply nitrogen, you've got to make sure there's good soil moisture there, you know, for the plants to respond. And in that year, the lock-up fertiliser, the tap turned off on this sort. You know, sounds familiar. It happened last year. You know, we put on a lock-up type fertiliser application. It came in really dry, and you know, that's the same 50 units of nitrogen didn't produce anywhere as much dry matter as produced in the winter in that year. So the trial really was turned upside down on its head in that particular year. And potentially that might happen to us this year, but it's just something to think about for this time of the year when soil moisture is so low, coming into that cold, wet part of the year. You've got to have a look at what's there in front of underneath the plant. I don't think there's a lot of benefit to going hoofing out heaps of nitrogen, hoping you're going to get more grass if there's not enough soil moisture there for the grass to respond. This was at the other point of the year, but I think it's relevant to what we're seeing at the moment. Thanks, Jasani. Spreading after the rain, if it's too wet, I always get that comment. There's plenty of ways that you can be innovative and get nitrogen out, especially if you're following cows around and not spreading huge areas. You know, 3-point linkage spreaders, get that extra axle off the paddock, boomless nozzles, and here's a Vicon spreader where this fella's put a 5 horsepower motor on on the PDO drive just to make it waggle so you can get some light machinery on. I mean, it means not lots of filling, but I think it's possible to do in a year when you might need to get on those paddocks. Have a look for insects. Red mite are out now. I've started to see them on paddocks already. I haven't seen a huge amount of black beetle yet, but they'll be there. Small conical snails, lucerne flea. This is small lucerne weevil, not as common, but can cause some damage in certain situations. Have a look at the plants. If you see some damage, get on your hands and knees, find out what it is. Get out there in the morning or in the middle of the day. Sometimes, if you need to pick what's there, and have a go and control them so that the animals are eating the pasture, not the bugs. So here's a bit of a summary then of all those different treatments. Adding ryegrass, adding oats to your ryegrass, $100 a tonne potentially. Defer your grazing, doesn't cost you anything. It's potentially 750 kilos of extra dry matter if you get your grazing deferment right from those trials that I showed you. Grazing residuals as well, doesn't cost you anything. Make sure you pull the animals out when you get to 5 centimetres. Put some nitrogen on. Can be, between $175 and $60 a tonne for your dry matter, depending on what sort of response you get. Gibberellic acid at 20 grams per hectare costs $15. If you get a 500 kilo response, it's $30 a tonne for your dry matter. There's some data out there that shows that red-legged earth mite, in a high population of red-legged earth mite uncontrolled is worth 2 DSC, which is about 600 kilos of dry matter. It doesn't cost very much to control them, so think about that when you're trying to maximise the feed going into your animals. That's about it from me. I'd put my phone number up there because, if you haven't used nitrogen or you haven't used gib acid, it's quite hard for me to generalise and say this is a recipe that you can all subscribe to without knowing your individual situation. If you're thinking about using it and you've got a bit of a plan to have a go, feel free to give me a call and bounce it off me. I don't mind talking to people about an idea that they've got that they might want to just have a second opinion to check whether they're on the right track. And it's not a plug for my business. It's just something I'm happy to do if you want to have a chat. I'll send the bill to Jasani.